baby.
Son of a...
These videos are not for children. If you're a children, then piss off.
Hey there, it's me, your least favorite YouTuber, the Infuso. And I've talked a lot about that 70s show here on the channel, as it's one of my all-time favorite shows. So when an official sequel was announced, I was more than a little bit invested. A return of the characters I knew and loved set in the decade that I originally watched the characters I knew and loved? Yeah, sign me up. And now that the past is finally here, join me in the present as we take a look back into the past that's presently taking place.
What? What does that even mean?
I'd like to start with a blast from the past, by catching up with all our favorite 70s characters in the 90s. First and foremost, I love the way the show uses and utilizes the previous show's leading and reoccurring characters. Their inclusions for the most part don't really feel forced, and they only occur when it could benefit the current narrative. It's fan service for the betterment of the plot. I really like this because it creates an atmosphere of anything could happen for the returning audience. And for potential brand new audiences, the show makes them understand the older characters while still justifying their place in the follow-up. Most of them aren't on the main cast, so they're not really relied on the way they once were, but they are still familiar elements that linger on. They're still vital, but they're not on the pulse of this new series. I have to applaud the series for this, because it would be very easy for these walk-on walks down memory lane to feel distracting from the plot at hand, but instead they're integrated into it. The way the original players are used in the series gives the new characters enough space and room to grow. This still allows the old Point Place gang to make major contributions to the new show. So for me personally, I think it's just the right amount of use of these characters. And I'd be all for them continuing the cameos, Easter eggs, and guest star spots so long as they continue to do it in a meaningful manner. Those returns are mostly pretty great, but as usual, I have some reservations. Immediately right off the bat after watching the first episode, I felt a little bit let down. I was really hoping that this show would be a return to form, seeing the characters we know and love come back, albeit with a couple more gray hairs and wrinkles. I know it'd be pretty improbable to expect them to recapture 1998, but I was hoping for something a little bit better than 2005. What I mean by this is, there comes a point in time in the show where some of the characters began to feel victims of flanderization, Eric Foreman most notably. Instead of being written to be a three-dimensional character who had all different types of traits, quirks, interests, and whatever else, suddenly he was just written as a nerd. And that's all there was to him. The character that once felt like a person suddenly began feeling like a one-note joke. And this new show really hammers that home, almost immediately. And then it doubles down in the following scene. It makes Eric seem kinda pathetic. I also didn't like that he was brought back and put in the same exact clothing he'd worn 20 years ago. And I'm also not a fan that he hasn't gotten a haircut in the last 2 decades. It's kinda off-putting, because most people don't dress the same at 38 as they did when they were 18. Maybe this was done for the benefit of the viewers. They wanted to remind us of the character we loved, but everyone else has a modern makeover that works well for them. Donna, Jackie, Kelso, Fez, they all still look just like their characters, but they look like the characters at later stages of life. So why is Eric Foreman frozen in 1976? Outside of this, he does feel like the same character, if not somewhat more exaggerated. His struggles of trying to relate to his child feel very real. And in just one appearance on the show thus far, he acted as the pilot plot's emotional core, making his one moment on the show meaningful. Donna doesn't have a whole lot to do in the first episode. She's just sort of there to support her daughter and comfort her husband, which kind of makes her feel like the glue that holds the whole family dynamic together. Outside of that, she's also said to be a relatively successful writer and is without a doubt the more down-to-earth parent, which should be a surprise to no one as everyone knows Eric's out in space. I think all of this is very on brand for the character. Donna's not really given a whole lot of time to shine here, but she is at least given a dignified comeback. And she does make appearances in following episodes. Eric and Donna's relationship, while still showing Eric being a little selfish or oblivious to certain things, does feel a lot stronger than it did in the final seasons of the show. It's actually pretty endearing to watch these two get back together as adults. It's sweet seeing them having made it out on the other side of the chaos that was the 70s. Watching them reenact their flirty behavior from the first episode was a really nice touch. And if nothing else, seeing where and how they ended up, it makes the series finale with the two reuniting feel more worth it. I think this pilot retroactively makes that last episode of the show seem somewhat more justified. I also like seeing the hindsight hypocrisy that Eric and Donna kinda lose it on their daughter for hanging out on the top of the water tower, the exact same spot where they spent most of their days growing up. While it does show growth from Eric and Donna, it also highlights a certain do as I say, not as I do philosophy that I think a lot of parents have. Regardless, they don't want their daughter taking the same risks that they did. Nor should they, because those risks had consequences for some people. I have mixed feelings about Donna and Kitty passive-aggressively butting heads, because that was definitely something that's happened before, sure, but that was one of the less fondly remembered arcs, and one that seemingly came to a close with the series finale, as the two shared a tear and a hug. All of that seems to be undone a little bit now, so I guess I take back what I just said about the justified part. But again, I guess fighting between in-laws is certainly not unheard of. I mean, it's actually a pretty common trope. I really like the idea of Red and Kitty helping Eric and Donna raise a teenager. It's kind of a sweet passing of the torch premise. And I think a part of me is gonna wish that the rest of the show was like this. Eric and Donna still seem like new parents, but that's because almost every year is a completely different experience with a child. And while they've mastered at raising an infant and, I don't know, whatever those little mutants evolve into next, a teenager is a whole different ballpark of rebellion and teenage angst, whereas Mr. and Mrs. Foreman are now veterans in said endeavor. The return of Red and Kitty Foreman as main characters is a very inspired choice. Both Kirkwood Smith and Deborah Jo Rupp bought their A-game, seamlessly slipping back into the roles they haven't played in years. They feel like the same old Red and Kitty, just with more life experience. I loved seeing their transition from parents into grandparents, and how similar but distinctly different those two experiences are. They are without a doubt the highlight of the show thus far for me, as they seem to approach their roles with the same enthusiasm and chops that they did in the actual 90s. They are actually perfect, and they alone are worth checking the show out for. I really love the absolute joy Red has when watching his son try to reprimand his daughter. I think that's very on brand for Red, but also very on brand for grandparents. I mean, my whole life, my father's told me, I hope you have one just like you, because I'm going to teach him all of your old tricks so he can do to you what you've done to me. So I think that a lot of parents who watch their own children become parents hope for a very similar thing. Initially, Kitty is so desperate for attention from the outside world that she guilt-trips her son shortly after his arrival, and then practically begs Red to open up their home to their granddaughter. And while Red is pretty reluctant on all the extra company, he still becomes fond of the 90s teens and shows compassion in silent gestures. It's a really sweet and sincere development that feels legitimate. Red has always been compassionate. Maybe not necessarily with his words per se, but with his actions. Because this isn't the only time he's opened up his home for somebody. Case in point, he scolds Nate for asking him for one of his flannels, only to later on place one on his car for him. It's kinda nice watching these two become intertwined not only in their granddaughter's life, but their granddaughter's group of friends' lives. Kitty sort of becomes a secondary mother figure to all these characters. And there's actually a pretty touching moment this season when Oz comes out to Kitty, who without fully understanding the weight of the moment, accepts him in passing before moving on. And then when she realizes how important this moment is to Oz, she nearly comes to tears with how honored she feels. I think overall, the Foremans seem to be a little bit more involved in this series than they were in the original, which is not a complaint. I buy into all the family dynamics on the show. The entertainment that Red gets out of seeing his son go through what he went through, watching the Foremans come together and make decisions as a family, I actually think these moments were the strongest parts of the first episode. But outside of the Foreman household, they did justice to a lot of the returning recurring characters. I have to applaud the way they handled Jackie. Toward the end of that 70s show, the creative vision shifted, and with it, so did Jackie's direction. While she was initially in an on-again, off-again relationship with Kelso, they'd seemingly end permanently when Jackie began dating Hyde. I don't want to go over this too much, but I think this particular couple led to a lot of growth in Jackie's character. And she kinda went through her own mini redemption arc that saw her become less of a caricature and more of a character. It was like a de-Flanderization, but unfortunately plans for the character changed. And the new showrunners decided to have the two broken up to tease a possible rekindling romance with Kelso, who would propose to her, she'd turn him down, only for her to somehow end up with Fez. In the same season that saw her try to make things work with Steven at the beginning, get proposed to by Michael shortly thereafter, she somehow ended up with Fez. I'm glad this series decided to move on from that mistake and have her get back with Kelso. While ideally I think Jackie would have ended up with Hyde, that really isn't a possibility here given obvious outside forces. So I think Kelso is almost an equally good choice, as the two have a long-standing history and even flirted with the idea of getting back together before Kelso moved to Chicago. For everything the show set up, them coming back together makes about as much sense as anything else. I also appreciate that 90s show didn't try to romanticize this coupling, as the joke of the scene that they're in together is their on-again, off-again romance, with Kelso noting that they were on their way to get remarried. In a way, this does kind of seem like a setback for both characters, as I think both Kelso and Jackie evolved a bit more as characters in the last couple seasons of the show. This show seems to dismiss that previous growth in favor of going back to a nostalgia act. But then again, I mean, we are talking about that 90s show, so it kinda is a nostalgia act any way you look at it. What I'm trying to articulate here is that Jackie and Kelso feel more like their characters from the first season of the show than they do their characters from the last season of the show. Although I will try to make an excuse for this here and say that sometimes when you're with the people closest to you, you have the tendency of reverting back to who you were when you met that person. Regardless, this is pretty noticeable if you're a fan of the show. I can understand the reasoning for pairing them together, and I don't hate it at all. It may be a bit of a downgrade in character development, but it is at least an upgrade in the entertainment department. So you win some, you lose some. Of course, Mila Kunis and Ashton Kutcher are always going to work better off each other than having her play opposite Wilmer Valderrama. Probably because Mila and Ashton are actually married. So if the chemistry ain't there, there may be a bigger problem. Though with the two of them having a child, it does make me wonder where Kelso's daughter Betsy is. Maybe the next season will answer that. The one major downside of this relationship is the awful light it paints the two in when Fez is brought into the fold, as he confesses to Kitty that Jackie had cheated on him with Michael shortly after the original series finale. It doesn't seem like they ever made up either, which is kinda sad to think about when thinking about our favorite 70s gang. Worst of all is that Fez remained heartbroken for the last 15 or 16 years, not feeling anything deep or meaningful until meeting Sherry, who we'll get into later. I think the way Fez's life panned out makes sense for the character. He began working with hair in the last seasons of the show, and he seemed pretty passionate about it. So this seems like a natural evolution of his character. With the last season of that 70s show making Fez a total ladies' man, I think his pursuit of Sherry and the way that he carries himself makes sense for the character. And out of all the original main cast members, Wilmer Valderrama's performance feels the most welcomed. He is the funniest returning regular turned reoccurring, and it legitimately feels like he, more than anyone else, had a story to tell. Donna's father and Eric's father-in-law, Bob, makes an appearance as well to celebrate his granddaughter's birthday. This might sound weird, but this was something I never really thought about before. The prospect of Donna and Eric getting married, then making Red and Bob family. I don't know why it never occurred to me, but it hadn't. And in practice, I think that that's a fun new layer to this friendship. Bob's always been a force of nature brought into Red's life through circumstances outside his control. First they were neighbors, and now they're in-laws and co-grandparents. Don Starks has barely slowed down, and he still brings the same oblivious, oafish energy to the role. There's just something infectious about this character's natural happy nature, and he was a much appreciated surprise. Another welcome surprise was the sudden re-emergence of Fenton in the season 1 finale. Fenton was one of the highlights of the later seasons of the show, showing up just as the show was about to hit its decline. The episodes that featured this character were always at least somewhat entertaining. So it was fun to see that after all these years, his feud with Fez is still ongoing, with the two still holding a hatred of each other over a pair of pants from a decade and a half ago. It's perfectly petty on both their parts, and even with the episode ending with the two calling a truce, I think there's a good chance we see them butt heads again as the show goes on. But if we don't, I think there's enough closure given to that story. The two are like this franchise's giant chicken fights. But unlike those giant chicken fights, they haven't overstayed their welcome quite yet. There's a lot about this show that I think is very interesting in concept and in premise, but I don't think it always hits the mark in execution. Turning into our parents is a very real thing. A lot of people do over time resort to what they were taught when they were younger, because ultimately that's your primary example of being a parent. But when Eric snaps and tells his daughter that he'd put his foot up her, just as his father before him has been known to say, it's not really played for laughs or for shock, so it just kind of sits in the middle ground in limbo. Not every moment lands, but still, plenty, if not most, do. The disconnect between Leia and Eric is very relatable, because I think almost everyone's had a point where they wanted to break away from their families a little bit more and become more independent. That's something timeless and universal. And to see it explored here as an introduction to the new characters and a farewell to the previous ones is actually one of the factors that I think works very, very well. We see how hard as a parent it could be to give your child free reign to the free world without them. And while Eric struggles with that, ultimately his love for his daughter trumps his fear of letting her go, so he allows her to spend the summer at Point Place with her grandparents. I'm gonna try to stop saying this word, but there's something really sweet about watching these two approach their later years, handing down their knowledge and advice to yet another generation of Point Place teens, becoming not just watchers, but mentors of sorts. Leo's occasional reappearances are right in line with the character, and Tommy Chong hasn't missed a beat. The show introduces him and brings him back at random intervals, just as the original series had. Sometimes providing some ironic assistance, and other times, just providing a punchline. Like how Kitty begins to rethink the circumstances in which she knows Leo. What with him being an older man who hung out with her teenage son. I think what makes Leo great is that you can plop him in anywhere, in almost any plot, without any context, and it will work more for the lack of context. For better or worse, there's a certain novelty of nostalgia that comes with seeing these characters all come back together. And the characters who couldn't be present are instead remembered as they're mentioned in passing. Lori gets a nameless name drop later on in the first season from her parents. Pastor Dave appears off screen in a certain section of a movie store. Hell, even Casey Kelso gets a mention. The one character that's very obviously completely absent is Hyde. It's an empty space that certainly feels strange, but it's completely understandable why it's unaddressed. With the real-life ordeal surrounding Hyde's actor, perhaps it's best to leave the character alone and silently retire him. It's unfortunate, but really, what else are you gonna do? But there are some moments that seem borderline bizarre without him. Like when Fez flashes back to his old Circle days and they're now Hyde hidden. It's really noticeable. And the fact that they haven't said anything in regards to his character is kinda a little off-putting from a continuity standpoint. Even if they said the character passed away or was in prison or something like that, I think that would be a satisfying enough reason without calling too much attention to the character's actual absence. But as it goes right now, there is no mention of Hyde. I know some people have theorized some things. I don't think that they hold any weight, because I think the show is currently going out of its way to not mention him, or have any mention of him. Again, I understand from a business standpoint, but it's times like these where I really wish that there was a separation of character and actor. If you don't want to bring the actor back, I think that you have more than enough valid reasons not to, but the character did exist, and it did have a pretty big part to play in the show. I don't think this fictional character should be punished for the man that played him.
That's just a classic no-win situation.
The sequel series recycles a lot of elements from the previous show, including plot points, story beats, and sometimes exact scenes. And while these references are appreciated, I don't think they ever hold up to what it is they're attempting to emulate. I absolutely hate what they did with the theme song. I understand that they were trying to put a 90s spin on that original song, but I don't really get that vibe from this. It just sounds like a really cover. Maybe that's in part due to how it's chopped up, but ultimately it comes off sounding more like the iCarly theme than it does the That 70s Show opening. And like the show that came before it, That 90s Show also isn't beyond the extended fantasy sequence that plays to whatever was current at the time. I have very mixed feelings about some of these scene transitions. Sometimes they feel like they're just sort of a lame holdover from the original series, but as time went on I started to find them a little bit more charming, which is kind of the same way I remember feeling about the original shots when I watched the first show as a kid. So if nothing else, it's on brand. Though I will still maintain I don't think all of them are great. Regardless, I don't want to make it seem like all these references or callbacks are unwelcome, because they're not. I think a good portion of time they're well done, and they reflect that not everything changes with the passage of time. The new gang seemingly reenact the season 1 episode The Keg in their pilot, when they find themselves with a keg, but now need to go on a mission to get a tap. They do go about things differently, and the outcome is also pretty different, but the story is mostly the same. Now, some people may look at that and think, wow, that's really lazy writing. They just rewrote an old episode of the old show. But I personally think it's pretty symbolic of the series itself overall, doing the same things but doing them differently. Having the same struggles but having modernized solutions. I also like this because it shows that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Despite the change in decades and eras, teenagers are still teenagers, and they still have most of the same teenage problems. And when these references aren't put in place to make a point, they're just some good old light fan service to die-hard fans while not engulfing this whole experience and alienating new viewers. Like for example, when the group finds the original gang stash hidden in Candyland. If you're a new viewer, that's probably lost on you, but you're not missing a whole chunk of the story. That's something we've seen Eric do in the past, so it serves as a nice little reference that makes this plot more plausible. However, we also know that his parents knew about Candyland, so how that got by them is, well, that's a good question. There's a couple references that might slip by a couple people in passing, especially to those who are new. Off the top of my head, there's small things like the helmet from the original show being in the background, and even having the furniture from the living room back in the day now be the furniture in the basement.
I don't know what you heard, but this show ain't free.
What the hell?
I don't know what you heard, but this show ain't free.
No one's gonna look in here, because they don't have a dog anymore.
Oh, this has to go. We don't have a dog anymore. Michael Kelso would never have done that.
Michael Kelso glued himself to our refrigerator. I think you're setting the bar kind of low. Hey, wait. Don't you want your present?
My dad is giving me the Vista Cruiser.
A car? You got me a car?
It belonged to your father.
They're all given just enough context to both please an older audience, but not diminish the newer additions. Sometimes it's done just to hold up the tropes the series builds, which I guess is good for consistency. Things like keeping Fez's country of origin a secret, having Red threaten to stick his foot where the sun don't shine, or having the main cast go to the hub. Although, a side note here, I noticed that the water tower says Michael and Jackie, which it did in the original show, but as of the season 8 finale, it should read Michael and Fez. So show, what I'm telling you is you did good, but you didn't do good enough. Overall, I think that the nostalgia plays heavily into the show without being too disruptive to everything new they have going on. So now that we covered the past, let's cover the present. If the present was in fact 1995. So if you liked this video and would like to see a part 2 talking about all the newer elements of this sequel series, and listen to me talk about all that it got right and all that it got wrong, then let me know in the comment section below by leaving a comment saying,
The 70s are back.
I was your least favorite YouTuber, Infuso, and I thank you for watching. Hope to see you in the next one.
I am vengeance. I am the night, and that was Infuso. Just remember, if you're not tuning in, then you're missing out.
So, if you like the words that came out of his mouth hole, and you too would like to become a V-generate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, nerds!
And if you're not joining the fun, you're in for one bad day. And you know what they say about having one bad day?
Catch him next time. Same bat time. Same bat channel.